Hey everyone, this is Mike and today I'm going to be talking about aggro management in Shadowbringers. In the previous video I talked about the tank role and how the homogenization kind of feels to me personally, and I asked people to write in the comments down below what they thought about the tank role themselves. And there were a lot of people that commented that they don't really like the way that aggro management works in Shadowbringers because it's a very big difference from what we used to have previously in the game than going into Shadowbringers, because Shadowbringers itself made a very big change to how the tank stance works, and it basically trivialized aggro management inside of the game right now, which is kind of unfortunate, but I'm kind of very 50-50 about it, and I'll explain why in just a second. So first of all, for those that are new to tanking in Shadowbringers, that have never tanked before, let me explain how it used to work. So right now in Shadowbringers, whenever you turn on your tank stance, you generate a lot of aggro, and it is quite literally impossible to lose aggro to someone else that is not a tank that also has their tank stance on. Outside of generating more aggro, there is also nothing attached to that tank stance itself. There aren't any bonuses, there aren't any negatives. It is quite literally just turn it on if you want aggro, turn it off if you do not want aggro. But that didn't really used to be the case in previous expansions. Back in the day, your tank stance would still generate more aggro for you, but it would also make it so that you took reduced damage. Warrior was a special case because they gained bonus HP and a healing buff, so basically kind of still the same, that they would like be more tanky, so to speak. But you would also deal 20% less damage, and seeing how Final Fantasy XIV is primarily a DPS focused game with healers and tanks having a very high DPS output, you of course wanted to play outside of that tank stance as much as possible, especially because in previous expansions we would also still have a DPS stance which you could not activate while you were inside of that tank stance, with Dark Knight being the exception to the rule there. But when it came down to Paladin and Warrior, they would either have to choose tank stance or DPS stance. You couldn't do both at the same time. And for example, when it came down to Warrior, you would also gain access to your strongest DPS tools whilst being inside of your DPS stance, like for example Felcleave was something that you would only have access to in Deliverance. If you were in Defiance, it would change to Inner Beast. So they did make some changes for that as well going into Shadowbringers, that they now evolve on top of each other, because of course the old tank stance and the stance dancing that we had back then is gone now. So because we had this aspect of dealing reduced damage within your tank stance, people wanted to try to be outside of this stance as much as possible so that they could spend as much time as possible inside of their DPS stance instead. And there was also good reasons for that, because you didn't need to be inside the tank stance to tank a boss itself. Because while a boss still did a decent amount of damage, you would have enough cooldowns to mitigate the damage output of those bosses, and your tank stance was something that you would only really use to generate the aggro that you needed, and then you would just switch to the DPS stance after that to deal as much damage as possible. Of course, whenever you're inside of your DPS stance, you're not generating that much aggro anymore, and you would be relying on the rest of your team to help you out to stay on top, because of course if you're on top of the aggro list, that is the person that the boss is going to be targeting. And there were a lot of different tools back then to help you out with that. Everybody, both the healers as well as the DPS, had some aggro management tools to make it so that they would either generate less aggro or to make it so that they could cut the current aggro that they had in half. Or even both at the same time, like casters had both back then. So there were definitely a lot of tools to do that, and then your co-tank would also be able to shirk you to give you a lot of the aggro that they had at that specific point, or you could just like Voke, then shirk, to make sure that you would basically stay ahead on that aggro list. And whenever you played in an organized environment, that was a lot of fun to kind of like try to manage the aggro generation, to make sure you would always stay on top. However, whenever you take it into a party finder environment, that is where things were a little bit different, because of course you're playing with a bunch of random players that might not care about mitigating their aggro generation as much as your static members might, and that could change your experience quite a bit. Instead of not having to play inside your tank stance at all, you might now have to turn it on every now and then to ensure that you stay on top. Maybe that's not even enough, and you might have to start using your aggro combo as well, which is something that we had back then, which again also something that is removed in Shadowbringers. But it also didn't really feel that good, because using your aggro combo was usually a DPS loss compared to doing the other combos that were available at that point. So you would basically be sacrificing your damage output because other players weren't doing their part when it came down to the aggro management, and that felt kind of bad. So whenever it came down to playing inside of an organized environment, I did really enjoy the way the old tank stance worked, because it felt like a team effort to ensure that your main tank would stay on top. But whenever you played outside of that organized environment and you were playing with players that just did not care, or when you're, for example, playing with players that are way over geared, because of course, if you're a new player coming into the tank role, or you're a returning player that took a year break from the game or something like that, if you're playing with players that are 40 item levels above you, it is also going to be difficult to keep the aggro from them, even if you're inside of your tank stance spamming aggro combos. So you could have a very different experience to how you experienced playing the game, depending on how geared you were compared to the other players that you're playing with, or depending on what type of players that you're playing with. Even if you are best in slot, you would still have to adjust your playstyle depending on what others were doing or weren't doing. So when it comes down to right now, with the current tank stance, how tanking works at the moment, I feel very neutral about it. On one hand, I do miss having to manage my aggro, having it be a team effort when it came down to endgame raiding inside of a static. On the other hand, whenever I go into a dungeon or whenever I go into a party finder for an extreme primal, that is where I do enjoy this change, because now I don't have to rely on 7 other players to do their part, so that I don't need to adjust my playstyle or sacrifice my DPS. Might sound a bit elitist to say it like that, but that's kind of how I feel about it. If other players were playing well and using their tools, I would not have to play inside the tank stance or sacrifice my DPS just to ensure that I would stay on top of the aggro list, whereas right now I literally don't care what other players are doing, because I'm always just gonna be on top as long as my tank stance is active. So that's kind of my take on it, a little bit split on how I feel about it, because I do kind of miss the old system, but on the other hand, when it comes down to playing with randoms, I definitely don't miss it, and I prefer the new system as well. It has definitely made the barriers to entry inside of the tank role as well a whole lot lower, so it's definitely more accessible to other players as well right now. You don't need to be worrying about it either anymore, so you can basically focus on other things like mitigating damage and doing your damage rotation as well. So that's kind of my take on the subject. Let me know in the comments down below what you think about it. Curious to see what you guys have to say. But on that note, I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.